Well, good evening. My name is Justin Barnard, and I serve here at Union University as an Associate Dean in the Institute for Intellectual Discipleship. And together with my colleague, Dr. Micah Watson, it is my distinct privilege to welcome you all to this evening's event. As almost all of you undoubtedly know, our gathering tonight is attended by deep sadness within the Union community over the loss of Olivia Greenlee. And even as we move forward with this evening's event, I think it's important that we acknowledge publicly what I am confident is true in our hearts tonight, namely that the Greenlee family and friends of Olivia continue to have our sympathy and our prayers during this time of grief. And as a public expression of our solidarity, I would like to invite all of you to stand as I read a short selection of Scripture and offer a prayer. Would you please stand? It's a reading from the Gospel of John. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die." Will you pray with me? Most merciful God, whose wisdom is beyond our understanding, we pray that you would deal graciously and gently with the Greenlee family in their grief. Surround them with your comfort and with your love, that they may not be overwhelmed by their loss, but that they may have confidence in your goodness and strength to meet the days to come. This we pray through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. As the national rhetoric in the public square makes evident, current discussion and debate about the moral legitimacy of same-sex marriage and the implications thereof for public policy matters has reached a critical moment in our nation's history. Earlier this week, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder delivered an address in New York at a human rights campaign gala in which he suggested that the efforts of persons who experience same-sex attraction who lobby for full equality under the law is, quote, a defining civil rights challenge of our time, end quote. Whether we agree with Holder's assessment of the significance of the LGBT activism or of his explicit invocation of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the present national conversation about same-sex relationships is one that now impacts every community in this country. Thus, as citizens, we have reason to be informed, to work out our political convictions in thoughtful ways for the sake of the common good. And for Christians in particular, these thoughtful political convictions must be expressed with uncompromising charity and with grace. We must learn to practice what Dr. David Dockery has called convictional civility as we bear witness in the public square. And learning this requires role models. Tonight, we are honored to learn from one whose public witness on the issue of same-sex marriage has been positively luminous. In the face of national public vilification during a 2013 appearance on CNN's Piers Morgan Live, Ryan Timothy Anderson modeled what it means to articulate grace-filled convictions in his defense of traditional marriage. And if I may say this, despite his youthful countenance, which you will see in just a few moments, Anderson is no novice in this challenge. In addition to his role as the William E. Simon Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Anderson also serves as the editor of Public Discourse, an online journal of ethics and public policy for the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey. What set the stage for Anderson's public engagement with the issue of marriage in our culture was his work on two recent significant publications. Together with his co-authors Robert P. George and Sharif Girgis, Anderson published a 2011 essay entitled "What is Marriage?" in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. This was followed by their joint co-authorship of the 2012 volume, "What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense," a book, incidentally, that was cited twice by U.S. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito in his dissenting opinion in the Federal Defense of Marriage Act case, United States versus Windsor. Anderson has subsequently been a tireless, winsome, gracious, and articulate spokesman for the cause of traditional marriage in our culture, appearing on such news shows as CNN's Newsroom, Fox News, and MSNBC, and publishing in such periodicals as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, First Things, the Weekly Standard, National Review, the New Atlantis, Touchstone, Books and Culture, and Christianity Today. Anderson holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton University and a master's degree from the University of Notre Dame. And when he is not testifying before congressional subcommittees, as he did last month in Indiana, or engaging in public debate, as he did earlier this week with the mayor of Fargo, North Dakota, and that's not a joke, Anderson spends his spare time writing his doctoral dissertation in political philosophy at Notre Dame, where his research focuses on issues of social justice. Will you please join me in welcoming Mr. Ryan Timothy Anderson?
Thank you. That's a much too kind introduction. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I like to joke that I like giving a talk on marriage at a university campus because it's not like the cable news shows. I get to stand at the podium rather than sit in the audience. And I don't have to worry about name calling. And that's one of the good things about this talk. One of the good things about this opportunity to have a talk like this at a university is that we can get away from, I think, some of the name calling and empty sloganeering that people on both sides of this issue can engage in. I think whether you're for redefining marriage or against it, there are people in both camps who haven't engaged in the conversation as I think all of us would like. And so hopefully tonight we can have that sort of conversations. I'm going to give some reasons for why I think marriage is and ought to be the union of a man and a woman. I'll pose some challenges for people who might be inclined to want to redefine it. During the Q&A, we can have some exchange of ideas and arguments and reasons. One of the first things I like to do is say what I'm not going to say. I'm not going to get in a conversation about theology here. The argument that I make about marriage is from a philosophical and sociological public policy standpoint. There are people on both sides of the marriage question who share theological convictions. There are some Christians in favor of redefining marriage, some who aren't. Same thing with the Jewish community, same thing with the Muslim community. So I'm not going to engage in the intra-theological debates. I'm just going to stay at a philosophical level. And I probably also won't say anything about the morality of same-sex acts or same-sex relationships. It's interesting that there are several people who I know personally who themselves are gay, don't think there's anything wrong with gay relationships, but are not in favor of same-sex marriage. They say whatever a gay relationship is, it's not a marriage. So I'm really going to focus on that question of what is marriage. That's what we titled the article that my co-authors and I published in the Law Journal up at Harvard. It's what we titled the book that just came out because it's the question that we think lies at the heart of all of these debates, and it's the question that many of our opponents refuse to answer. They're very good, I think, at public relations. They have a great slogan. It's marriage equality. It fits on a bumper sticker. They have another bumper sticker, love equals love. They have the equal sign. And they're really good. I mean, to their credit, they've been able to encapsulate a slogan and an image that captures their argument. They haven't been as good at actually making an argument, though. In order to say that you're in favor of marriage equality, you have to be able to say what marriage is. I would venture a guess that everyone in this room is in favor of marriage equality. We all want the law to treat all marriages equally. What we might disagree about is what sort of a relationship is a marriage. And only if we know what a marriage is can we then know if the law is treating marriages equally or not. Because every marriage policy, whether you're in favor of redefining marriage or not, every marriage policy will draw a line between those relationships that are marriages and those relationships that aren't. If we want to draw the right line, if we want to draw a line that's based on principle, a line that reflects the truth, we have to know what marriage is. And so in the time we have together tonight, that's what I'm going to try to address. When my co-authors and I were surveying the literature of those who favor redefining marriage to include same-sex relationships, we saw that the implicit answer to that question, what is marriage, is that marriage is an intense emotional relationship. It's your number one person, in the words of John Corvino, a philosopher at Wayne State University, that the marital relationship establishes the relationship with your number one person, your most important relationship, your most intense relationship. It's about commingling assets, caring for each other, inheriting wealth. But what really sets it apart from other friendships and other types of relationships is the intensity or the priority that this relationship takes. My co-authors and I argue that this gets marriage wrong. And we say it gets marriage wrong rather obviously from our perspective. One is that it just collapses marriage with companionship in general. It can't actually distinguish what makes marriage qualitatively different from just friendship. It's just that marriage has whatever friendship has, but with greater intensity. So it's a quantitative difference, not a qualitative difference. The second argument we would make is about why this fails, is that it can't explain the three historical norms within Western culture and within American law that have been associated with marriage. That marriage is a monogamous institution, a sexually exclusive institution, and a permanent institution. But on their account, if marriage is just about an intense emotional relationship, why does that have to only be between two people? More than two people can form an intense emotional relationship. So what is it about twosomes that require that, or what is it about marriage that requires twosomes? And why couldn't marriage be between three or four if what sets marriage apart is the emotional intensity? Likewise, why would marriage have a presumption of permanency? The slogan, marriage should last as long as the love lasts, seems to be a good descriptor for an understanding of marriage where it's just based upon emotional union. Marriage should last as long as the emotions last. May or may not be permanent. And then lastly, why would it be sexually exclusive? For some people, an emotional connection with their spouse will be enhanced by only sleeping with their spouse, but perhaps for other people, that emotional union will be enhanced by having relationships outside of marriage. But what is it about marriage understood as emotional union that would require sexual exclusivity? Those are the challenges that we've put in writing and in different addresses that we've given to those who would redefine marriage. And so during the Q&A, I would welcome any responses. If you're someone who is in favor of redefining marriage, what principle would you draw that would redefine marriage to include the same-sex couple, but only the couple with an expectation of permanency and sexual exclusivity? That would be the challenge. The last criticism we make is, on this understanding of what marriage is, why is government in the marriage business at all? If marriage is just about an intense emotional union, why is the state getting in the bedroom? It seems like if marriage is just about romance, we wouldn't need government issuing license and regulating adult romantic relationships. So that's the argument we make, the critical argument against this revisionist view of marriage, and then some of the challenges that we would pose to those who would advance it. But that said, let me paint two complementary stories that we give in our book and in various articles about what we think marriage is, why marriage matters, and what the consequences would be of redefining marriage. And those will be the rough three portions of this talk: what marriage is, why marriage matters, and then consequences of redefining marriage. The philosophical approach that we take in the book comes out of a natural law tradition, and we really follow almost verbatim the works of Aristotle on this, where he says that you can analyze any type of community by looking to the acts that the community engages in towards the goods that the community pursues, and then looking at the norms or the commitments that the community adheres to, and that the community kind of requires, membership in that community requires. So one of the examples that we give would be just looking at a university community. So take Union University as an example. What makes Union a university, an academic community, is that the members of the community engage in academic actions. What are academic actions? Your professors write books and articles, they deliver lectures, you read their books and their articles, you attend their lectures, you take notes, you might visit office hours, students will write term papers, professors will grade term papers. Those are the sorts of actions that make a university a university. It's not the same thing as mowing the lawn or changing the oil or something like that. That would be distinctive of a lawn care community or a mechanic community. But a university community engages in academic, intellectual action. Those actions are oriented or ordered towards a certain good, and it's the good that sets the university apart from other communities. It's the good of the truth. What all of those actions are geared towards is discovering the truth, appropriating the truth into our lives, coming to know the truth, eliminating error out of our consciousness, eliminating error, preconceived notions, mistaken beliefs, so that we can better understand the truth and then live the truth out. Hopefully that's what goes on in the classroom here at Union. From my understanding, it seems that that is what takes place. So then if that's the good that the academic actions are ordered towards, what are the norms, the commitments that's required of you? This is where academic integrity comes into place. The demands that you don't plagiarize your papers, that you cite all of your sources, that you reveal all of your data, including the data that might call your hypothesis into question, precisely so that another scholar could look at your work, check to see if you made any mistakes, and if they do catch a mistake, they say, wait, I think you missed something important in this data set. You don't resent that fact, you actually welcome it, because in pointing out a mistake that you've made, they've eliminated ignorance from your life and they've helped shed light on the truth. At least this is what universities should be about. This is how the academic enterprise should take place. So that's partly my proselytizing for good academic life. But that analysis, which I hope is non-controversial, can now show us how that same act, goods, commitment framework can help us see what makes marriage different from other communities. What makes the marital community different from the university community or different from the athletic community? We argue that what makes marriage different is that it's a comprehensive relationship, and it's comprehensive in precisely those three aspects. It unites spouses comprehensively, a union of hearts, minds, and bodies. So that's the act. It's a comprehensive act. It unites them with respect to a comprehensive good, not the good of knowledge of Shakespeare, not the good of winning a football game, but the good of the creation of an entire new human being, and then raising that human being to participate in all of the human goods. So it's a comprehensive good. And then it demands of the spouses a comprehensive commitment, permanent and exclusive. So let me unpack those three steps a little bit. This is the most dense part of the talk. If we make it through the next 5 to 10 minutes, it's smooth sailing here on out. All right, so a comprehensive act. To see how a husband and wife can unite comprehensively, what would be required is that we'd unite them at all aspects of their personhood. If I want to unite comprehensively with another person, it would need to be a union of hearts and minds and bodies, because I'm a bodily being and this other person is a bodily being. We're not ghosts and machines. We're not souls that somehow are associated with bodies, but we're ensouled bodies, or we're embodied souls. However you want to think of it, we're a mind-soul-body unity. And so to unite comprehensively with another person would require uniting with that person at all levels of their personhood. Ordinary friendships are just unions of hearts and minds. You don't ordinarily unite bodily with your friends. But you do unite bodily with your spouse, and that transforms that friendship in this comprehensive direction. So then you might ask, what sort of act can unite two people in this comprehensive way? And for that, we draw a parallel between what is it that makes a single person comprehensively unified. So what is it about my body that makes it one organism, rather than just a clump of cells, just a heap of body parts? The answer here is that all of my various organs and subsystems, my heart, my lungs, my kidney, my skeletal system, my circulatory system, my respiratory system, they're all actively coordinating with each other towards the common unity, the common good of my organic bodily life. Now, with respect to every biological function, locomotion, digestion, circulation, I walked here on my own, I ate dinner on my own, my heart's pumping, my lungs are breathing as an individual. With respect to one function, I'm incomplete though. And there's a single biological function that takes place with a mated pair. So that when a man and a woman unite in a conjugal act, they truly form a two-in-one flesh union, to use the language of the Hebrew scriptures. The Bible there is not speaking poetically or metaphorically. It's really revealing a truth at a deep metaphysical level. The two become one flesh to such a great extent that 9 months later, it might require a name. And that then tells us something about the good that this comprehensive act is ordered towards. Because the love-making act in this conjugal union is also the life-giving act. So this tells us something about the trajectory of the action. It's ordered towards a comprehensive good, not any particular good, like the good of discovering what the truth about marriage is, but a comprehensive good, the creation of an entire whole new human being. And then the family life of the husband and the wife, the mother and the father, to raise that human being, to then experience goodness in all of its dimensions. Knowledge of truth, friendship, appreciation of beauty, good health, a subsequent marriage itself. These are the types of things that conscientious parents want for their children. They raise their children to experience this wide array of human goods. And so it gives the marital relationship a certain orientation in a way that university communities aren't ordered towards creating and then raising new life. Auto mechanics aren't ordered towards creating and raising new life. But this is kind of the crowning fruit of that marital communion, precisely because that act that unites them as husband and wife also is what makes them mother and father. So that's comprehensive act, comprehensive good, comprehensive commitment. It then calls for these commitments of exclusivity and permanency. And it can explain why the type of exclusivity that it calls for is sexual exclusivity, because it's that bodily union, that conjugal union, that sexual union that transforms an ordinary friendship into this marital relationship, which is why by attending this lecture, none of you are cheating on your spouses. It doesn't call for intellectual exclusivity. By playing tennis with someone other than your spouse, you're not cheating on your spouse. It doesn't call for athletic exclusivity. The type of exclusivity that marriage calls for is sexual exclusivity because it's the sexual act that's distinctive of the marital communion in the way that intellectual acts might be distinctive of an academic community and athletic acts distinctive of the athletic community. And then likewise, both the orderedness towards new life and the comprehensive union can explain why it demands a pledge of permanency. Ordinary friendships, you don't pledge to be friends. Some of you freshmen, you won't still be friends with your seniors. Freshman roommates, you might be friends now, but no one's requiring you to be best friends forever. And yet for spouses, there is this expectation that you will love each other till death do you part. Partly that's because you want to have this stable family life that's appropriate for raising new human beings to maturity. But part of it's also that a comprehensive commitment is called for a comprehensive union. To be comprehensive, it's not just comprehensive at this moment of time, so uniting at all levels of my personhood here and now, but comprehensive throughout time. And if I only pledge to love you for 5 years or 10 years, and I have this exit clause in the back of my mind, I haven't really united comprehensively. A comprehensive union is going to be open-ended throughout time. So that's the basic, most dense philosophical part of tonight's talk. And that's, it takes the most pages in the book. It's what we found by looking through the natural law tradition in ancient thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Musonius Rufus. So in the ancient Greeks and the Romans, We see it in Augustine and Aquinas, Luther and Calvin, Christian thinkers. We also see it in the canon law, the common law, and the civil law traditions. We see it in Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Kant. We see it in Eastern thinkers like Gandhi. They don't articulate it in all of the same words that my co-authors and I use, but they all get at that basic reality, which to us suggests that this vision of what marriage isn't the province of just our theory of natural law, or just the church's moral theology, or just the church's sacramental theology, but that it's part of human nature, and that different theological and philosophical and political communities, while they've disagreed about so much else in life, have all kind of agreed on this basic aspect of marriage, because they've latched on, some with greater and some with lesser success, this aspect of human nature. This aspect of human nature being created male and female, being capable of forming this type of union being fulfilled in the creation and raising of new life, and this type of union calling for certain commitments. That's why we see marriage in different political, philosophical, and theological communities lived out and discussed in these various different, at the margins, but the core remarkably similar. That said, you could say, all right, you've offered an interesting philosophical account of what makes the marital community different from the athletic community or the scholarly community, what makes it different from ordinary friendships. Why should we care? So we're moving into the second part of the talk. If the first is, what is marriage? The second is, why does it matter? So here I'm just going to kind of go from a public policy standpoint of why someone would care what marriage is, how the state defines marriage, why government's in the marriage business. And so from this perspective, you could say that marriage exists to bring together a man and a woman as husband and wife, to then be mother and father to any children that their union creates. Here it's based on the anthropological truth that men and women are distinct and complementary. It's based on the biological fact that reproduction requires a man and a woman. It's based on the social reality that children deserve a mother and a father. Whenever a baby is born, a mother will be close by. She's frequently in the same room. Thank you for getting that. That's a fact of biology. The mom is going to be present when the baby's born. The question for culture, and therefore the question for law, is will a father be close by? And if so, for how long? And the social function that marriage performs in different societies across the globe and throughout time is to maximize the likelihood that that man commits to that woman, and then the two of them take responsibility for raising that child. Because when this doesn't happen, social costs run high, and when it does happen, children are given a great benefit in life. Part of this also is based on the reality there's no such thing as parenting. There's mothering and there's fathering. Just as men and women are distinct in the type of union that they can form, the complementary nature of male and female, husband and wife allows for the type of comprehensive action and bond they can form, so too the distinction between male and female has a bearing on how they interact with children. We always cite David Popenoe and Brad Wilcox, some social scientists who have looked into the empirical realities of how parents interact with their children. And so David Popenoe, a professor of sociology at Rutgers University, writes, "The burden of social science evidence supports the idea that gender differentiating parenting is important for human development and that the contribution of fathers to child rearing is unique and irreplaceable." End quote. He then concluded, "We should disavow the notion that mommies can make good daddies, just as we should disavow the notion that daddies can make good mommies. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary culturally and biologically for the optimal development of a human being." End quote. Here's what he's getting at in that quote. He's not saying that men have to interact with children in a certain way and that women have to interact in a different way. He's just saying that on average and for the most part, that's what comes naturally to them. And I think most of us have experienced this. So if I was to ask you to engage in a thought experiment, it's Saturday morning and one parent is wrestling on the living room floor with a 7-year-old boy, teaching the boy how to be masculine and aggressive, but not to be violent. So how to put people in headlocks, but not to pull hair or bite or gouge out eyes. Which parent is most likely in the living room? it's going to be the father. Not because there's some gender stereotype in which we've forced fathers to wrestle on living room floors with kids, but that's just what comes naturally to fathers. If the mother's in the living room, she's probably telling the dad not to roughhouse too much, because that's what comes naturally to mothers, for the most part and on average. In the same way, if you've seen the way fathers will throw babies up in the air and mothers will don't throw them so high. These are just some of the gender differences in parenting that for the most part happen and then have consequences. So one of the things that we know is that children who grow up without their fathers being involved are more likely to commit crime. And the social scientists have been able to trace why. Wrestling on the living room floor actually matters because it's teaching that young boy how to mature into a young man and to keep those somewhat manly, masculine, potentially violent tendencies in check. This is one reason why sports are so important. It's how do you channel some of those energies, some of those emotions in a constructive rather than a destructive direction. And that's one of the things that fathers particularly do for their boys. What we see that fathers do for their girls is that it's normally, on average and for the most part, the father that scares away the bad boyfriend. Partly because he's typically larger and has a deeper voice and can scare away boyfriends better, but also it's partly because he was once a young man himself and he knows what the bad boyfriend might be looking into, might be after. And so he is more alert to the type of guy his girl is going out on a date with. So then it's not surprising that we see the social science, girls who grow up without their fathers involved in their life are more likely to have an out-of-wedlock childbirth because it's the father who's going to have that unique role in the life of the daughter. Not to say that mothers can't scare away bad boyfriends, just to say that typically, for the most part, that's something that fathers do. So this is why I'll move to a quote that I like to read just because it's citing an impartial source. President Obama, who himself was raised by a single mother and who has spoken, I think, fairly movingly about how he suffered not knowing his father and how now it inspires him to be a good father to his two daughters. He's experienced what it's like to be raised without a father. This was the quote he gave in a speech just a couple years ago. It was before he evolved on the marriage issue. President Obama said, quote, "We know the statistics that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it." End quote. That's why the state's in the marriage business. Not because it cares about my love life or your love life, not because it cares about romance, but because it cares about ensuring that as many children as possible are conceived inside of a marital relationship and are then raised to maturity by their married mother and father. What we've seen over the past 40 or 50 years as the marriage culture in America has collapsed, as out-of-wedlock childbearing has risen and as divorce have risen, is that this is when child poverty increases. This is when social mobility decreases. This is when crime increases. This is when welfare spending explodes. So everything you could care about, if you care about the poor and you care about limited government, if you care about social justice and you care about liberty, is better served by the government promoting the truth about marriage, encouraging men and women to commit to each other as husband and wife permanently and exclusively, and then being mother and father to their kids, than to have the state pick up the pieces of a broken marriage culture. Defining marriage correctly and encouraging marriage is actually a way that the government limits itself. Government has to do less if civil society, and the central institution of civil society being the marital family, does what it's supposed to do. And what's interesting about this is that the state does this without banning anything, without limiting anyone's liberty. So the state promotes marriage, but it doesn't say that two people of the same sex can't live with each other or love each other. So in all 50 states, they can live with each other and love each other. They can go to a house of worship and have a same-sex wedding ceremony performed. They can work for a progressive business and have marriage benefits offered to them, if the house of worship chooses to and if the business chooses to. It's very much a live and let live situation. They promote marriage as an ideal, but they don't criminalize or penalize or ban any consenting adult relationship. But what's at stake if the state redefines marriage is that it would then coerce all citizens and all businesses and most religious communities, not houses of worship, but most other religious communities, into treating the same-sex relationship as if it's a marriage, even when doing so violates the conscience and the religious beliefs of those individuals, those businesses, and those institutions. So that then brings me to the third and final part of this talk. What are the consequences of redefining marriage? And for this, I'll hit on three main areas. And I'll say it under the broad umbrella of ideas have consequences. Redefining marriage, the state will teach a lie about what marriage is. It'll teach a falsehood about marriage. And in doing so, laws teach. Laws then affect culture. Culture then affects our beliefs. And our beliefs then impact our actions. And so all three of the consequences that I'll mention follow from what would happen when the law teaches and then citizens believe a falsehood about marriage. The first is that there would be no institution left in public life that would uphold, even as an ideal, the fact that every child deserves a mother and a father. If you redefine marriage to make it a genderless institution, you redefine marriage to exclude the norm of sexual complementarity, there would be nothing in public life, nothing in civil law, that would suggest that kids deserve a mom and a dad. It would say that two moms, two dads, same thing. Mothers and fathers are interchangeable. It would change the marriage institution away from the needs of children and much more towards the desires of adults. If you think about how I opened the talk tonight, I said there's this revisionist view of marriage that sees marriage as mainly an intense emotional relationship. And then there's this view of marriage that my co-authors and I present, that it's a comprehensive relationship that's inherently ordered towards the creation and raising of new life and therefore calls for certain commitments. The law would be putting its thumb decisively in the favor of the intense emotional union paradigm. And we've seen the law do this once before. In the late 60s and throughout the 70s and the 80s, states one by one redefined marriage to eliminate the norm of permanency through the creation of no-fault divorce. In the common law tradition, you would file for divorce and you would cite cause. And the causes in common law were the 3 A's: abuse, abandonment, and adultery. 3 serious reasons for calling off a marriage. With the introduction of no-fault divorce, a spouse could abandon his or her other spouse for no reason at all, for any reason or for no reason at all. And what we saw in the decades after the introduction of these laws was that divorce rates doubled. Now, not all of the rise in divorce is the fault of the change of the law, but some of it is, because the law now taught something. It taught that marriage need not even have the expectation of being permanent, that you could get out of marriage for any reason. I've heard a couple legal scholars say that you have greater legal liability to your plumber or your roofer in some jurisdictions than you do to your spouse. And so the law taught something about marriage. Just so, redefining marriage would teach something here. Right now, we have out-of-wedlock childbirth rates of 40% of all Americans are born to single mothers, 50% of Hispanics, and 73% of African Americans. The absentee father crisis is probably the biggest social crisis in America today. But how would the culture insist that fathers are essential when the laws redefine marriage to make fathers optional? That's the question that I want to ask President Obama after reading that quote where he says about how important fathers are and what happens to children who grow up without fathers. How will we continue to send that message that fathers are essential when the laws redefined marriage to make them optional? So that's the first consequence. There won't be an institution left in public life that upholds that ideal of married moms and dads for kids. The second consequence goes back to how I opened this talk, is to say that there's no logical, rational principle for why the redefinition of marriage would stop here. And to illustrate this, I'll just introduce 3 new terms that we came across while doing research for this book. And the first is the term throuple. A throuple was a 3-person couple. This was in New York Magazine, a mainstream liberal magazine that many New Yorkers read. And the argument here is that if you were a judge on the Supreme Court and someone came before your court and said, "Your Honor, the law of Tennessee is denying me my marriage equality," My throuple wants marriage equality. Same argument being used right now for the same-sex couple. So what if the same-sex throuple or the opposite-sex quartet came in and said, we demand marriage equality? What principle would you appeal to if you're the judge on that court? Because the principled reason why we arrived at monogamy in Western law, the reason why every U.S. state has a requirement of treating marriage as a union of two people, is that it's one man and one woman who can unite in the act that can create new life, and every life has one mother and one father. And marriage is about uniting those people into a stable relationship. But once you say the one man, one woman aspect is irrational and arbitrary and perhaps bigoted, what's magical about the number two? What principled basis do you have for denying marriage equality to the throuple? So that's the first subsection of the stopping point. The next new term I'll introduce is the term monogamish. This was introduced in the New York Times Sunday magazine profile of Dan Savage, one of the most prominent gay rights activists. And Savage was arguing what straight couples could learn from gay couples. And so he wants to retain the number two. That's the monaga part of monogamish. But it's the mish rather than monogamous. It's a play on that term. Because he was saying that relationships should be sexually open if the spouses agree to it. That there shouldn't be an expectation of sexual exclusivity. He says that's an unrealistic expectation. That it's unrealistic and somewhat inhumane to think that you could only have one sexual partner for the rest of your life from your wedding night on. And that this is why so many couples have marital problems, that they sign up for this unrealistic demand and then they fail at living it out. So he said it would be much better, provided there's no deception and there's no coercion, that spouses can agree to have an open marriage. His term openness, I think some communities it would be infidelity. But he was saying that was one of the virtues that we could learn on how to further redefine marriage. The last term was introduced in the Washington Post 1 month after the Supreme Court issued its ruling on the Defense of Marriage Act. And this is the term wed lease. A wed lease is a play on the term wedlock. If wedlock denotes something that's sturdy and strong and permanent, a wed lease denotes everything that's the opposite. And the argument here was that just as you can lease a car or lease a house, you should be able to lease a spouse. The idea behind this was that human beings have been signing up for an unrealistic expectation of thinking that they could love one other person for the rest of their life. That's unrealistic. You can't pledge to love till death do us part. Better to have a 5 or a 10-year marriage contract, which could then be renewed on good behavior. But if it's not going well, you could just walk away from the marital relationship after 5 or 10 years, and you wouldn't go through any of the trauma of divorce. That what makes divorce so traumatic is that you had an unrealistic expectation that you were going to be with this person for the rest of your life. And then when you couldn't live out this unrealistic expectation, your heart gets broken. So better to not have the unrealistic expectation in the first place, only have a 5-year marriage license. If it's going well after 5 years, renew it for another 5 years. If it's not going well, get out of it. Okay, I said I wasn't going to say anything about theology or morality. So whatever your theological or ethical evaluation of group multi-partner marriage, the thruples, or sexually open marriages, or temporary marriages, think about the public policy consequences. And again, remember that the state's not in the marriage business because it cares about my love life. The state's in the marriage business to get a man and a woman to commit permanently and exclusively to each other so that any children that their sexual union creates will have a stable family with the love and the care of a mother and a father. But with the throuple, with the monogamish relationship, with the wed leases, what all of those do is they increase the likelihood that a man has multiple sexual partners for short-lived durations, which means they maximize the likelihood that he creates children with multiple women to whom he's not permanently committed, which means it increases the likelihood of creating fatherless children and fragmented families. The exact opposite of what we're trying to get out of the marital institution as a policy matter. And yet this is the logical trajectory of what eliminating the male-female aspect of marriage sets us on. So those are the second set of consequences. And the reason I kind of belabor this point is because you frequently hear, well, how does my gay marriage affect you or your marriage? Or how does letting Adam and Steve marriage hurt you or your marriage? it's not so much that it, comes into someone's home and assaults their marriage, and that it changes the public understanding of what marriage is. And then that public understanding, because the laws teach, will then shape how people behave, and it will shape what subsequent legislation looks like and what subsequent judicial decisions look like. The last consequence is one that we're already seeing, and this is the consequence of religious liberty. We've already seen in jurisdictions that have redefined marriage, in Massachusetts and Illinois, and where I currently reside in Washington, D.C., that Christian adoption agencies have been forced out of the adoption business. These agencies said, we're trying to find homes for orphans in our care with married moms and dads. We're not preventing gays or lesbians from adopting from other agencies. We just would prefer to place the kids that we've been entrusted with in homes with mothers and fathers. And they've said, we have social science that suggests children do best with a married mom and dad, and we have the First Amendment, which protects our religious liberty right to do this. And yet in all three jurisdictions, they've been forced out of that space. Not because of government funding, because of government licensing. It's illegal to run an adoption agency without an adoption license. And in all three jurisdictions, the government said, you're engaging in discrimination unless you place a child with a same-sex couple on equal footing as you would with a married mom and dad. And they wouldn't give them the adoption license unless they agreed to do that. And they said, we're not violating our conscience, we're not violating the God that we exist to serve, and so they were forced out of that business. This does nothing to help orphans. This does nothing to make it more likely that children find homes, makes it nothing more likely that more adults are willing to adopt. And one of the reasons why religious adoption agencies are so important is that they have an ability to go into the churches and to get families to be willing to do foster care and to adopt children. They have access to this huge audience on Sunday mornings and on other kind of events to try to get them into the adoption space. And yet they've been forced out of that space. We've then seen cases of photographers and florists and bakers and innkeepers who have been coerced by the law into using their artistic gifts and talents into celebrating same-sex relationships. The best known case of this is the case of Elaine Photography. It's the one that's gone the furthest in the court system. And what was at stake here was an evangelical photographer who was asked by a lesbian couple to take pictures of their commitment ceremony. And the photographer said, look, I have no problem taking pictures of gay or lesbian people. I do it all the time. I do have a problem of taking pictures of a gay commitment ceremony because that would be using my God-given artistic talent. And wedding photographers aren't just kind of like DMV photographers. Like they're doing something that's intricately involved with telling the story of a wedding. This is why engaged couples spend a while investigating which photographer they want to do because they need someone to capture their story, to then tell the story of their engagement, of their wedding, of their love for each other. And so anyway, Elaine said, I can't do this because you'd be asking me to use my God-given talents into celebrating something that I think violates God's plan for marriage. There were other photographers in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and yet the couple filed a complaint with the New Mexico Human Rights Commission, and Elaine lost. And then she appealed it up the court system, it got to the New Mexico Supreme Court, and she lost again. And the concurring opinion was written, said that the price of citizenship was that Elaine had to take pictures of the same-sex commitment ceremony. Not that the price of citizenship was that the same-sex couple should just go to a different photographer. It was that every photographer in the state of New Mexico had to be willing to take pictures of same-sex ceremonies or else stop doing wedding photography completely. That case is now pending review by the Supreme Court. She's appealed it up to the Supreme Court. So those are the three broad areas of consequences as I see it. One is that it will fundamentally redefine what marriage is from a more child-centric institution to just an adult romantic institution. Two is that these redefinitions won't stop here. In fact, it just seems to dissolve marriage out of existence. And then three is that there will be huge religious liberty prices to pay. So with that, I will open it up to questions. Raise your hand and I'll call on you. Or maybe Justin will call on you. Or there'll be a microphone.
Questions?
I think there was one right in the front.
Yes, Ryan, would you speak to the far left agenda? I think you kind of touched on this in the book. The far left agenda, as you kind of touched on just a moment ago, of the dissolution of marriage and consequently of society with
Yeah.
this project.
Well, it's really interesting to see that for a fair part of the past 50 years, many progressives were against marriage. They thought marriage itself was a backward institution, that was a patriarchal institution, that is a repressive institution, and that part of the sexual liberation movement, part of the sexual revolution, was that it was liberating us from the confines of this antiquated institution. And it wasn't until the prospect of same-sex marriage that we then saw these progressive voices actually become in favor of marriage. I think it's a somewhat disingenuous shift on their parts. I think they want to say whatever marriage is, it has to include same-sex relationships. But after that, we actually don't really think there should be such a thing as marriage. When I was at NYU's law school last April, I'll be out there again this April, oddly enough, but I debated a sociologist who more or less said, well, I don't think there should be state-recognized marriage. I think consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do without government putting their thumb on the scale one way or the other. And now again, think about what that means as far as the thruples and the monogamous relationships and the wed leases. It's not the redefinition of marriage so much as the abolition of marriage. It's the elimination of marriage as a category with some discrete and somewhat tangible delineations. It's more or less saying that marriage is whatever each and every individual wants it to be. It's not a common institution to whom we can conform our lives. So we can conform our lives, make choices that conform with the demands of marriage. This view is that we can just recreate marriage to be anything we want it to be. And I think the consequences of this, especially in kind of American life, we've already seen the consequences of this, particularly for the least well-off. College-educated Americans get married and stay married and have children inside of marriage at rates that are remarkably similar to the 1950s. And as a result, they don't have problems with poverty or social mobility or with crime or anything like that. You look at those who don't finish high school or who only finish high school, look at their rates of marriage, divorce, out-of-wedlock childbearing, and they're really not quite good, and it then traps people in generations of poverty. So this is why Charles Murray is a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He wrote a great book titled Coming Apart, and he said, the elites need to start preaching what they practice. Because he says what happens with many of the Hollywood TV shows is they promote a vision of marriage and family life that very few elites actually want to live out because they know it's not good for them. Which is why I would say next to none of my college classmates will have a child outside of wedlock, will have kids who will have a child outside of wedlock. Those sorts of behaviors they know just don't make for a flourishing future, either for themselves or for their kids. And yet you look at the non-college educated, and it's 40% of all Americans, right? And so again, I think this will be, Rusty Reno, the editor of First Things, says that same-sex marriage is a luxury item paid for on the backs of the poor. And I think Rusty's exactly right. Other questions? Yep.
You talked a lot about how we should care about marriage because it has to do with bearing and raising of children. Does the government have any interest in promoting marriage among elderly people?
Yep. So this is, I guess, a variation of the infertility question. And there are a couple of ways in which you could think about how to respond to something like that. The first is to say that government, all legislation is kind of at the wholesale level, not the retail level. So government makes law for the rule, not for the exceptions to the rule. So every child has a mother and a father, although not every marriage will produce a child. So the marriage as an institution and as something that the government cares about from a public policy perspective is to make sure that every child is raised by that man and that woman who conceived that child. Recognizing an elderly marriage does nothing to undermine that purpose, and it seems in some cases actually to advance that purpose. So if you take, this was the question that Justice Kagan, I believe, asked during the oral arguments when they were at the Supreme Court. She said, well, what about the 50-year-old couple? Why is the state interested in their marriage? Because we know they're not going to produce any kids. And the response was, no, they're not going to produce any kids because obviously the wife in this case is past menopause. But if the husband's faithful to his wife, he won't be creating kids with someone other than his wife. So the marital institution, even when it's not going to result in a child, is still preventing the damage that would result from the non-marital childbearing. And the other point is that it takes nothing away. It doesn't send a signal that fathers are interchangeable with mothers or that fathers are optional or anything like that. So it has none of the costs. It has some of the benefits. But then the most important part is that it's truly marriage. If you think about the most philosophically dense part of the talk tonight, it's what makes a marriage is that comprehensive union between husband and wife. And what actualizes that is the conjugal act that unites them as two in one flesh. And the elderly couple engages in the same act on their honeymoon when they're teenagers and when they're middle-aged and when they're elderly, that unites them as spouses. It's not that 24 to 48 hours later, sperm and egg unite, or that 9 months later a baby is born. It's that they unite in that conjugal act that consummates, that seals, that actualizes and expresses their marriage as a marriage. It transforms a union of hearts and minds into this bodily and therefore comprehensive dimension. So my callers and I say that, we should be recognizing the marriages of people of all ages because they're real marriages. They serve some of the public policy concerns, and they have none of the pitfalls. They send none of the destructive messages. Yeah.
Mr. Anderson, I just wanted to thank you again for articulating this in such a powerful way, the moral and intellectual underpinnings of this institution that we define as marriage. And you mentioned divorce. And one thing that concerns me as a Christian and as a conservative is that if you look at the numbers, there's a lot more people getting divorced than there are trying to be unified in a same-sex marriage. So is there any hope politically for changing our divorce laws, or do you think that is so politically explosive that it's not going to happen?
Well, as Christians, hope is a theological virtue, so we should always be hopeful. I'm not very optimistic about the short run for divorce law reform. Justin mentioned when he introduced me that I was just in Bismarck and Fargo, and they tried to, if I remember correctly, introduce a 1-year waiting period before divorce, because they saw that many couples, if they're just asked to wait a year before finalizing their divorce, are actually able to reconcile, especially if they're encouraged to seek out professional counseling. And so their idea here was that, look, we're not going to prevent you from divorcing. Heck, you could even live apart during the 1-year waiting period, but we're not going to legally finalize it. And hopefully during that time, you might try to work things out on your own. Maybe there would be a way of giving a tax break to seek out counseling, something like that, how you could. And it was voted down. And what was explained to me was that it was outside money from divorce attorneys. So this is one of the problems of legislation, is that there are special interests that are involved in various ways. But anyway, I think the basic question is correct. We focused our book, the What is Marriage book, largely at the male-female aspect, because that's the question right now that's at stake. That's not to say that it's the only or the most important question, but it is to say that it's the decisive question. If marriage is redefined to exclude the male-female aspect, it will cement that revisionist conception of marriage in our law and make it that much more difficult to do the cultural work to restore a healthy culture of marriage, to help people see that it's not just about their soulmate. That's the Hollywood conception of marriage. And if we enshrine that further in law, how much harder would it be to combat the 40, 50, 70% out of wedlock childbirth numbers, or the 30 to 40% divorce numbers? There are all sorts of things that we would like to be doing rather than debating the definition of marriage. But if you get the definition wrong, how much harder will it be to live out the truth about marriage? Yep, there's a question over there.
Just to kind of go on the Obama quote that you cleverly use. In the statistics that he was referring to, and that a lot of the national community, when they talk about single parent homes, and if there's just a mother or there's just a father, and a lot of the senses they're talking about children that are born of a man and a woman, and then one of the parents exits the situation. So those statistics are based off of relationships that are incomplete and not, by definition, as they naturally would have been when the child was born. So in a way, I guess I just don't understand how the application of children from single-family homes applies to children that, say, could be adopted by two monogamous people in a relationship.
Gotcha. Yeah. All right. So that's a great question. And so let me clarify. So I didn't, at any point during the talk, use those statistics to say this is why same-sex attracted people or people in same-sex relationships shouldn't be raising kids or something like that. I wasn't making a comparison between how children do when raised by their biological married mom and dad to children of same-sex couples. I'll do that now, but the reason I didn't do that in the talk is because that's not the main comparison or the main reason of what gets the state in the marriage business. What the state's trying to say is that if we're not in the marriage business, heterosexual people are going to keep having sex, kids are going to keep being born, and there won't be any institution that tries to encourage these people to get married before they have kids and to then stay married once their kids arrive. And that's why the state's in the marriage business. Then you ask the question, all right, well, wait, what about a same-sex couple who might adopt a child, or what is increasingly becoming the case, a same-sex couple who will create a child using artificial reproductive technology with either donor sperm or donor egg or a surrogate womb. And there are a couple of things that we know about this. So far, there have been 3 large, random, representative samples of households that included same-sex headed households that raised children. And all 3 have come to results that are consistent with the earlier findings, that children do best when raised by their married biological mother and father. There are now dozens and dozens of other studies that have shown that lesbians are actually the best parents. And these are the studies that always get the headlines in the New York Times. But they haven't used large samples, they haven't used representative samples, and they haven't used random samples. And from a non-random, non-representative sample, you can conclude exactly nothing about the population as a whole. In order for social science to draw representative conclusions, it has to use a representative sampling technique. So we only have 3 studies that have done that. And even of those studies, none have been longitudinal. They've all been a snapshot study, which shows what does the child look like at this moment in time. We haven't had any studies that look throughout time. And those are the studies that we do have when they've investigated single parenting, they've investigated divorce, divorce and remarriage, cohabitation, and marriages that stay together. So we have studies that use large, random, representative samples that are also longitudinal and that have compared single parenting, divorce, divorce and remarriage, cohabitation, and then the intact biological married family. And those have consistently shown that intact biological mother and father are vastly best for children. And now we have 3 that are large, random, and representative, though not longitudinal, that include same-sex parenting arrangements, and the conclusions are consistent. We also know something about why this is the case. There are 3 kind of vectors that can explain why marriage matters. One is biology, one is gender, and one is stability. And so let me just say a word about those. Biology is that having a biological connection to your child seems to matter. They're still trying to figure out why, but they can tell that even when couples adopt a newborn baby from infancy, there still seems to be an added hurdle by not having a biological connection. So 2 couples could go home from the hospital on the same day with a day-old infants, and the couple that has the biological connection will have a slightly easier time raising that child. And they don't know if it's something to do with the father's pheromones with the child, if it's the mother who can better hear the child's cry, because apparently biological moms can better hear their own baby's cry. They don't know what it is, but having a biological connection with breastfeeding, there are a lot of different hypotheses, but they know the biology matters. They then know that gender matters. Having both a mother and a father matters. And that, single parents, cohabiting parents, things like that, you don't necessarily have both throughout the long haul. And lastly, they know that stability matters. And this is where divorce, live-in boyfriends, cohabitation that lasts for a couple of years and then stops is rather unstable. So the biological married mother and father home has both biology, gender, and stability in a way that all of the alternatives don't. In fact, the same-sex parenting arrangement frequently will have none. At most, only one of the parents will be biologically related to the child. So if it's a same-sex lesbian couple, it might be one of their eggs, one of their wombs, but it'll be someone else's sperm. If it's the same-sex male couple, it might be one of their sperm, but it'll be someone else's egg and womb. So both parents of the same-sex couple won't have a biological connection. There won't be gender complementarity with parenting. You'll get 2 moms or 2 dads, but you won't get one of each. And then frequently there won't be the stability. what the social science shows so far is that lesbian relationships are the shortest lived of all relationships. And this somewhat sounds counterintuitive because most people think that women are really good at emotion and intimacy and they would be really good at relationship building. But it tends to be that precisely for that reason, they're the shortest lived. And it has nothing to do with homosexuality. It just has to deal with the gender distribution of the relationships. So they study 3 different relationship types: double woman, man-woman, double man. The shortest is the double woman, the one that falls in the middle is a double man, and then the longest, the most stable is the male-female. And what they find is that 2/3 of all divorces are initiated by women. The reason that the lesbian relationship is too short is not because it's homosexual, because it's double female. Women tend to have very high levels of expectation for emotional intimacy and satisfaction. You've probably never heard a guy say, "Oh, I broke up with her, my emotional needs weren't being met." Right? That's a stereotypically female type explanation. So now imagine if you have 2 women. That's why they're shortest lived. It's not a homosexual aspect. So again, one of the concerns here is it's not that lesbians can't love their kids or can't be good parents, but it's that 2 women can't be a father to that child. And 2 women, thus far, the social science say, probably won't be together on average as long as a husband and a wife. Gay relationships, gay male relationships, the science suggests tend to be longer lived than lesbian relationships, but tend to be more sexually open. This is where you get the monogamish thing. And again, that's because men aren't as concerned about sexual exclusivity. Women tend to be the ones that are more concerned about exclusivity. Again, these are all on average, but this is what we know so far about the various relationships. So that's how I would respond to the question about Obama's quotes not talking about gay parenting. Yes, but what we do know about same-sex parenting suggests that it would follow right in keeping with those statistics. Another question back. Yeah.
My question is, what is our recourse? You've articulated the problem very clearly tonight, and I appreciate that. But it seems like in states like California, Utah, even though popular vote has sought to retain what traditional marriage is, it's been overturned by the judicial branch.
Yep.
What is our recourse? What is
Yep.
your recommendation?
That's a great question. I'll answer that partly by saying not just what's our recourse given judicial activism and just disregard for democracy and the rule of law and problems like that. Because, we have those problems not just on the marriage issue, but we see the healthcare reform is also being a disregard for the rule of law and things like that. And it's just a problem that I think our form of government right now is going through some challenges. But let me say something about the kind of the long-term trajectory for the marriage movement. And here I'm just going to take my bearings from the pro-life movement. Because if there was a setback because of judicial activism and someone usurping the authority of citizens and their elected officials, it's been the pro-choice movement. In 1973, the Supreme Court strikes down abortion laws that protected unborn babies in all 50 states. The ultimate of disregard for rule of law, democratic republicanism, representative government, with one stroke of a pen. No constitutional basis whatsoever for striking down those laws. And at the time, you had elected officials who were pro-life evolve to become pro-choice. We forget that Ted Kennedy and Jesse Jackson and Bill Clinton and Al Gore were once pro-life, and then they evolved to become pro-choice. You had all of the elites say that pro-lifers were on the wrong side of history. You then had public opinion that in the late 70s got to be 2/3 in favor of abortion, only 1/3 pro-life. And then you had demographics, where they were saying all of the young people are in favor of abortion, that it's the wave of the future, and that the last pro-lifers would be in geriatric wards and in the Vatican. And now, young people are more pro-life than their parents. My generation's more pro-life than my parents' generation. A majority of Americans, when forced to answer the question pro-life or pro-choice, identify as pro-life. The past 10 years have seen more state-level pro-life laws passed than the previous 30 years combined. And the largest denomination in America, which was once pro-choice and applauded the Roe v. Wade decision, is now the largest pro-life church in America, the Southern Baptist Convention. We forget that some of our friends in the pro-life movement weren't always with us, which should give us hope that some people who aren't with us right now in the marriage movement might be with us. But what explains the changes that have taken place over the past 40 years? It's that you had pro-life scholars and activists and statesmen who did the work of making the case for the unborn. It wasn't enough just to say what they were for. They had to explain why, and then they had to embody it. So you got pro-life academics who wrote the books and the articles from philosophy and theology and science, making the case for the humanity of the unborn and for the personhood of the unborn. You then had politicians like Henry Hyde and Ronald Reagan craft the policies. Henry Hyde, the Hyde Amendment, someone had to come up with it. Someone had to get it passed each year on the Appropriations Committee. This is the amendment that prohibits the federal government from funding abortion. Ronald Reagan's the only sitting president to ever write a book in office. The title of that book was Abortion and the Conscience of a Nation. He used the bully pulpit because he was the first governor to sign in a law that liberalized abortion, and then he regretted it for the rest of his life, and he became a big champion of the pro-life cause. Then we get the crisis pregnancy centers, we get the Susan B. Anthony list, we get the Feminists for Life, we get Americans United for Life, we get National Right to Life, all sorts of organizations doing the education work and doing the embodiment work. Crisis pregnancy centers taking in women who face troubled pregnancies. The various foster homes and adoption agencies finding homes for these children. Now that explains why my generation's more pro-life, because people have done that work. So what's our recourse is that we now have to do a better job of doing all of those same things, whether it's intellectually or politically or legally or culturally, on marriage. We have to write those books, those articles, we have to pass those laws, we have to defend those laws, we have to create the institutions, the cultural institutions that embody this vision of marriage. Then 40, 50 years from now, we might be in a much better position. But all of the work that's taken place, my generation wouldn't be as pro-life as it is if it wasn't for the work of my parents' generation. And so my children's generation will or will not be in favor of marriage based upon the work that my generation does. So I don't know, it's not the best of, what's our recourse. It's just that we each have to bear witness to the truth in whatever way our vocation requires of us. Live out the truth about marriage in your own life and then advocate for it, teach it in whatever setting your life takes you. Okay, great.
Okay. My question has to do with your natural law argument as the basis for what marriage should be. There's kind of two parts. The first is if there's not philosophical agreement that natural law is a way to come to value judgments, is it even possible to have good discussion about this without talking past each other?
Right.
And then the second part is there's been agreement that homosexuality is not natural or homosexual marriage is not natural for a long time. But the pro-homosexual marriage would say that it's just been culturally repressed. People haven't been able to say that it's natural because it's repressed. So what's the change that causes us now to not agree on what we've supposedly agreed on for centuries?
Great questions. On the first one, I think you're right. There's no agreement about what sort of philosophical framework we should be operating from or what sort of discourse we should be having. But I think the way that you actually arrive at that agreement is by having the discussion. So you don't first agree on a natural law framework and then have the discussion. You just start exchanging ideas, start exchanging reasons. Ask someone, well, what do you think marriage is? And then say, wait, well, that vision of what you think marriage is doesn't seem to account for all of these other things that we know are true about marriage. How does your vision of marriage explain monogamy or exclusivity or permanency, or explain why government should care about the marital relationships in a way that it doesn't care about my best friendships? So it's a dialectical process in which you make arguments, you give your best reasons for what you believe. Your opponent will make his or her best arguments, give reasons for what they believe, and then you go back and forth in an iterative process. I think that's the only way forward for any question, whether it's questions about economic policy or foreign policy or social policy. We're all going to come at it from slightly different presuppositions, from slightly different comprehensive doctrines, to put it in Rawlsian language. And then we just have to reach each other in where the others are coming from and where we're going to try to make those connections. But in the same way that you wouldn't have to say that we have to agree to some meta-ethical framework to conclude that theft and murder and rape are wrong. But we can give, some people give a Kantian argument for why those things are wrong. Some people give utilitarian arguments. Some people give natural law arguments. Some people give divine command arguments. And yet we can all agree that rape, theft, and murder shouldn't be allowed. In the same way, you might come at it from a more theological perspective. You might come at it from a Kantian rather than a natural law perspective, a utilitarian. There will be lots of different ways for discussing what marriage is, why marriage matters, consequences of redefining it. But it's just a matter of actually engaging, listening, giving, and taking of reasons. For your second question, I think it's interesting to say, why is it now that we're getting to same-sex marriage? And I don't think it has so much to do with the natural or unnatural aspect as it has to do with just the logic of the sexual revolution. I think only in a culture that has already debased marriage and gotten human sexuality radically wrong is same-sex marriage even a logical possibility, let alone something that's plausible to be redefined by the courts. So only in a culture that's had 50 years of the hookup culture and of divorce and of extramarital sex and of non-marital childbearing is it easy to make that last connection of connecting dots to the last one of two people of the same sex can engage in all of those same behaviors. Right? So for us, the job is not to say, all right, well, let's just double down on our mistakes. It's let's start deconnecting those dots. Let's start moving the causal chain in the other direction to minimize extramarital sex, to minimize non-marital childbearing, to minimize the hookup culture, to eliminate divorce, those sorts of things. That's how I would, because I'll say one more thing about the natural, unnatural thing. I think a lot of it has to do with saying that whatever we have a desire for, provided it doesn't hurt another person. So it's Mill's harm principle is morally not only allowed, but is morally kind of salutary. So consenting adults should do sexually whatever consenting adults want to do if they have a desire for it and it doesn't cause harm. That's basically the framework of the sexual revolution. And then I think same-sex relationships follow from that, as night follows from day and as day follows from night. There was a question up front. Yep.
First of all, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. We all really appreciate it, I'm sure. My question for you, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the role the media has played in shaping the cultural acceptance of same-sex marriage, and if you think that the media can play a role in changing the conversation.
Yes, that's a perfect question to end on. The media has been incredibly destructive of the family. And I would say that the television show Glee has done more to corrupt a young generation than anything the Supreme Court has done. That both law and culture, they influence each other and they influence ordinary people. And so Glee is a catchy show. It has show tunes and songs and things like that. But the message that it has sent is one of consenting adolescents should do whatever consenting adolescents want to do. It hasn't sent, and the same thing when I was a kid, now I feel old, when I was a kid, it was Beverly Hills 90210, or it was Melrose Place, or it was Married with Children. I mean, you could go through The Simpsons, a list of TV shows. These are the things that really shape our moral imagination and our cultural imagination. So the media has been bad in the entertainment realm. It's also been bad in the news realm. This is one of the things that's been frustrating to me, is that they'll report saying, why do you think the state should ban same-sex marriage? Or they would say, the citizens of Tennessee voted to ban same-sex marriage. But no citizen has ever voted to ban same-sex marriage. All of these marriage amendments, all they do are deal with definitions. They define what marriage is. They ban no behavior. Certain behaviors are banned. There is a ban on selling large sugary sodas in New York City. Mayor Bloomberg passed a ban on that. There's a ban in indoor smoking. These are things you can't lawfully do. There's no ban on getting gay married. 2 men, 2 women can live with each other, love each other, go to a church, have a wedding ceremony performed. It's just not going to be recognized by the government. But governmental recognition or non-recognition is not the same thing as governmental bans. So that's been annoying in just how, and the reason they use this language is that most Americans are in favor of freedom. So if the government's banning something, it's probably bad. So we're not in favor of bans, we're in favor of marriage liberty or marriage equality or freedom to marry. And so the other side is, again, to their credit, used really crafty slogans. Here's what I would say about the opportunity going forward. People said that the founder of Fox News was a genius because he found a small segment of the media audience that was not being served, half of the American public. And so he created a conservative news network. You had ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and MSNBC all catering to people left of center. And he said, I'm going to create a news network that caters to people right of center. And that's what we got with Fox News. Fox is also the TV station that airs Glee. If you look at the cultural programming of Fox, it's not particularly conservative. It's not particularly friendly to conservatives. So if you're someone who's interested in both making money and doing something good for society, create a network that airs conservative programming that's not cheesy. Because more or less every program that attempts to be conservative or wholesome or something like that, family values, is something that you would never want to watch. You would be embarrassed if your friends walked in and caught you watching it. You would never post it to Facebook or tweet it or something like that. So imagine if we could have something that's artfully done, well-crafted, that's not cheesy, but that also didn't undermine our values. This is the type of TV show that you as a parent would want to watch with your kids. It's the type of TV show that you as an advertiser would want to advertise your products on because you know families are watching who might then go out and buy your products. So there's a huge market here. That I've been telling this to people for a year now, and I feel like I should just do it myself to make money, but it's not where my talents lie. Like I'm a pointy-headed academic. I'm not someone that's going to do the media thing. But I do think that this would be a Fox News, but for culture. And then that would then shape the cultural imagination, the moral imagination of people. I think more people's expectation for marriage has been shaped by the TV shows and the movies they watch than by the Bible they read or by the philosophy books they get assigned in class. We need both. We need pastors doing their thing, academics doing their thing, but we also need artists and musicians and TV producers and actors doing their thing. All right, so with that, I'll stop.
Thank you.